He was simply sitting on a park bench holding a cup of coffee, reading the newspaper under an old tree, until a young police officer decided that the color of his skin was reason enough for suspicion. Dawn stretched across Magnolia Park in Charleston, casting the warm golden light of the American South sunbeams, filtered through the canopy of ancient oaks, falling onto a weathered wooden bench like slivers of old memories stirring awake. On that bench sat an elderly black man reading the Charleston Gazette in a crisp white shirt, neatly pressed slacks, and polished shoes. In his other hand was a steaming plastic cup of coffee, and in his eyes, calm, dignified composure. His name was Louis Barrett, 83 years old, a retired educator, one of the contributors to educational reform laws, following the landmark Brown v. Board of Education ruling. But to passers-by, he was a quiet old black man on a bench, and in a society that still hasn't learned how to see the person beyond their skin color, that alone became the reason for a brewing storm. At a distance, a young white police officer named Brady Jensen, who transferred to Charleston just a few months ago, was on patrol. His face was stern, his eyes scanning the park like he was searching for something out of place in an otherwise peaceful scene. Then his gaze stopped fixed on where Louis sat. There was nothing wrong, no unusual behavior, no noise, no group gathering. But Jensen stopped. A black man elderly alone doing nothing, sometimes to a mind already shaped by bias. Silence itself is a threat. Jensen didn't approach immediately. He circled, he observed. He waited, like a predator, not because there was prey, but because instinct told him to assert power. And Louis, he didn't flinch. Or rather, he noticed, but didn't care. Because he had lived through times when simply walking into the wrong coffee shop could get someone like him dragged onto the sidewalk. He had stood beside John Lewis and had sat in congressional hearings. A glance from a young patrolman wouldn't shake him, but that piece was only surface deep. Beneath it lay a system that was always ready to repeat its mistakes if no one stood to call it out. And Louis Barrett, though weary, would have to stand once more. But this time he wouldn't be standing alone. Brady Jensen stood about 10 meters from the bench, his eyes fixed on Louis Barrett. His hand had unconsciously drifted to the radio clipped to his belt. In his earpiece, Jensen's voice came through softly but deliberately. "Dispatch, I'm observing a suspicious individual. Male black, approximately 80 years old, sitting alone at Magnolia Park. There's a leather bag beside him. No threatening behavior observed, but intuition says it's worth checking." The dispatcher responded with mechanical indifference. "No reports in the area. No support is needed. Situation noted." Jensen smirked a smile of someone who believed they held control. There was no one around to stop him. There are no official cameras. Just that silent older man, with clothes too tidy and eyes too composed for Jensen. That composure was unnatural. He began to approach slowly, like inspecting a suspicious package. Across the street outside the cafe, a few customers started paying attention, but no one intervened. A young couple stopped walking. An older man walking his dog turned back. The air around them thickened, as if someone had gently tightened a rope around the neck of a city, too accustomed to silence. Louis looked up for the first time when Jensen's shadow stretched over the bench. He wasn't surprised. He folded the newspaper, laid it across his knee, held his coffee and met the officer's gaze. "Good morning. What are you doing here?" Jensen asked, tone devoid of warmth. "Drinking coffee, reading the news, sitting all legal." Louis replied not loudly, but with the tone of someone who had fought too many battles and won. Jensen squinted. "You live around here." "I've lived here since before you finished grade school." "Officer, let me see some ID." Louis leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Under South Carolina state law, I'm not required to show identification unless suspected of a crime. And I don't believe you've stated one, have you? Jensen's face hardened. His hand grazed the holster at his belt, an unnecessary gesture, but one heavy with implication. A soft breeze swept through the park. Dry oak leaves drifted to the ground. No one spoke, but the silence was the ticking of a countdown. In another corner of the park, a man was watching, not through a lens, not a reporter, but eyes sharp as razors. Julian Carter, assistant U.S. attorney, just returned from Washington to visit his mother. He sat on another bench, not far away, and had seen everything from the beginning. The coffee in his hand was still hot, but his gaze had turned cold as steel. Inside his coat, his DOJ badge gleamed, and Julian knew if Jensen took one wrong step, this wouldn't be just another isolated incident. Louis Barrett didn't know someone was watching over him, but he didn't need to. He had never needed a protector to know he was in the right. He only needed to hold his ground. The question was, did the other man know he was already in the wrong? Brady Jensen's tone began to change. No more polite inquiries or veiled suspicion. Now his words carried the weight of command. I'm ordering you to stand up and surrender your bag for inspection. Louis curled his lips. Not a smile, but the reflex of someone far too familiar with unreasonable demands wrapped in the language of law. I haven't broken any law. I'm not armed. I'm sitting here reading the paper. You could be hiding something in that bag. With your uncooperative attitude. You're calling this uncooperative? Louis slowly placed his coffee on the ground, his hand resting on the worn leather bag beside him. I call it knowing my rights. Jensen exhaled sharply through his nose. That word rights was what he hated most, especially when it came from a man. Society never expected to be educated, much less to carry himself with dignified poise. Across the way, Julian Carter tightened his grip around his coffee cup. The veins in his hand stood out. He had already started recording his body. Cam embedded in the lapel of his jacket, a device he always carried even when out of uniform. He recognized the signs of an encounter drifting toward violation, and Jensen was tiptoeing across the threshold. On the bench, Louis remained calm, but his eyes had sharpened like a surgeon's scalpel. If you want to search my bag without probable cause or a warrant, he said, then I'm not refusing to cooperate. You're refusing to uphold the law around them. The atmosphere began to shift. An elderly couple stopped beneath an old tree, eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. A young mother pulled her son away from a nearby swing. None of them looked away. They were listening, and that made Jensen uneasy. Jensen took a step forward, his hand settling on his gun belt. Last chance. Stand up, or I'll be forced to detain you for obstructing official duties. A beat of silence. Louis Barrett didn't move. His hand gently gripped the carved wooden cane resting beside him, his voice low, dry and sharp as a vintage vinyl crackle. I was arrested in 1963 for sitting in a whites-only section. Bitten by dogs in Montgomery. Knocked down on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. I haven't laid a hand on you, Officer Jensen, but if I must, I'll show you that history doesn't rest quietly on this bench. A strike of words, not loud or insulting, rang like a wake-up bell, and it made Jensen freeze. For a moment, he no longer saw a fragile 82-year-old man in front of him. He saw a symbol, a mirror reflecting his ignorance. From a distance, Julian Carter rose to his feet. His hand moved silently into his coat fingertips, grazing the edge of his DOJ badge. Everything was now one breath away from crossing the point of no return. And in the center between a young officer unraveling under the weight of challenged authority and a federal prosecutor now advancing from behind, sat one older man, not angry, not afraid, just someone who had outlived every cheap threat. Jensen hesitated. Inside his head, half-remembered training protocols flickered. His commanding officer's voice echoed from some old drill. Maintain control. Don't let the subject dictate the situation. But the man in front of him. Louis Barrett was unlike anyone he'd ever encountered. Louis's gaze remained calm, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with memory and experience, and something in it made Jensen afraid. Not of physical harm, but of exposure. Jensen squared his shoulders, preparing to grab the leather bag, when a voice rang out from behind, deep and resolute. "That's enough. Officer Jensen." Jensen turned. A black man in his early 40s, neatly dressed in a tailored suit, with a stern expression, was walking toward them. No shouting, no haste. But each step seemed to slice through the tension, as if cutting the very air taut enough to draw blood. Who are you?" "Jensen?" blurted, his hand still hovering near his gun belt. The man didn't answer immediately. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a slim leather wallet, and slowly opened it, so that the noon sun caught the sharp gold gleam of the badge. DOJ, United States Department of Justice. "I'm Julian Carter," he said, "Deputy Director of the Southeastern Civil Rights Division, U.S. Department of Justice. And I've been recording this entire encounter from the very beginning." The air seemed to freeze. A man walking his dog came to a dead stop. An older woman quietly raised her phone. Two teenage joggers veered off course, but their eyes stayed locked on the scene. Jensen froze. His hand dropped from his weapon grudgingly. He tried to keep his voice steady. "I was just doing my job." The gentleman wasn't cooperating. "He didn't break any laws," Julian replied. "No," raised voice. "There is no room for argument. What I just witnessed and recorded was an unconstitutional act, a racially motivated act of harassment, directed at a U.S. citizen who did nothing but sit on a public bench." Jensen tried to smile, but his lips twitched. I didn't know who he was. I just had a feeling." "And that's exactly your biggest mistake," Julian interrupted, "that you didn't know who he was." Louis stood up. Not quickly, but with quiet strength. He picked up his leather bag and held it to his chest. "Inside this," he said slowly, "is the original letter Martin Luther King wrote to Thurgood Marshall about the Voting Rights Act of 1965, a draft of an unpublished speech from Morehouse. Testimonies from people tortured for sitting at a whites-only lunch counter." Jensen swallowed hard. Julian stepped forward once more. "You touched history with hands that didn't understand it. And now you'll have to answer to the law. Savannah is no longer a silent city." "Officer Jensen." The park fell silent. A phone camera clicked. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve and asked, "Why is that man getting yelled at, Mom?" And from within that silence, for the first time, Jensen took a step back. The young officer now stood frozen. His hand had dropped from his weapon. His eyes darted back and forth between Louis Barrett and Julian Carter. One is a living memory. The other is the law incarnate. But the older man wasn't finished. Louis Barrett took a single step forward. His hand reached for the dark brown leather bag, the very object that had nearly triggered an uncontainable storm, and slowly opened the flap. The onlookers held their breath. They expected a document, a protest, or even a legal rebuttal. But instead he pulled out an old photograph, faded but still clear enough to see. A group of black men and women standing on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Opposite them, a line of police officers attacked dogs and tear gas rifles. In the center, a young man crouching to shield a woman knocked to the ground. It was Louis Barrett, decades ago. "I'm the last one alive in this photo," Louis said. His voice wasn't loud, but it rang louder than any birdsong in the park. The others beaten, disappeared, or silenced until death. He handed the photo to Julian. Then he turned his eyes to Officer Jensen. "I don't need you to know who I am. But I do require that you know this. I have the right to sit on this bench in a public park without suspicion, without being touched, and without having to pull out this photo to justify my right to exist." The crowd murmured. A middle-aged woman leaned down to her daughter and whispered, "That's Mr. Barrett. He taught at Howard. He rewrote the laws for this whole state." A college student lifted their phone and began live streaming. Their voice trembled. "Everyone, if you don't know, this is historian Louis Barrett. This can't be ignored." Julian turned again to face Jensen. His eyes were sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. "Do you still believe this was just routine engagement?" Officer Jensen." Jensen said nothing. Sweat beaded on his forehead, though the sun had not risen. From the distance, the sound of patrol sirens echoed. A Savannah PD SUV pulled into view. But no one seemed to care what the department would do now, because the real storm had already been captured, archived, and broadcast. In the corner of the park, the live stream view count climbed 12,000 viewers in under 8 minutes. A pinned comment read, "My friend just sent this to CNN." Louis returned to the bench. Not in defeat, but as a declaration, he would not leave the space. His blood had paid for. His hand rested gently on his cane. His felt hat tilted slightly under the shade of the tree. Julian remained standing, a silent sentinel. And Officer Jensen still couldn't explain why he suddenly felt so small. Not in front of old age, but in the face of history. As the Savannah Police Department SUV rolled in, its tires crunched softly against the damp brick path of the park. The crowd had grown. No longer a scattered group of onlookers, but a true gathering. Locals had arrived, from early morning joggers to office workers stepping off the bus. All paused, drawn in by something they didn't yet realize would become history. The live stream by a student named Raina Carrington had surpassed 30,000 viewers. Tears welled in her eyes as she spoke into her phone. "This is Louis Barrett, a historian, a man who fought for voting rights. The same man my grandfather used to talk about. And now he's being treated with suspicion, in a place he helped open for people like me." Behind Raina, an older man stepped out of the crowd. It was Mr. Lenny Douglas, a veteran who lived 3 blocks away. He pushed his old bicycle forward, pulled out his phone, and said in a gravelly voice, "I was arrested in this park back in 1968 for carrying a Malcolm X book. Today I'm watching history repeat itself. But this time, we've got cameras." The camera panned to Julian Carter, who was now speaking with 2 officers from Internal Affairs who had just arrived. No shouting was needed. He displayed his badge. "Assistant U.S. Attorney, Civil Rights Division. This is a violation of the 4th Amendment prohibiting unlawful search and seizure," Julian said clearly, his voice firm enough that several in the crowd clapped quietly. One officer leaned into his radio and muttered, "Call it in. We may need to initiate a state-level internal investigation." But the emotional peak didn't come from badges or officials. It came from someone no one expected. A boy no more than 12. His name was Malik. He padded up to Louis, stared at him for a moment, and asked softly, "Sir, is it true you once wrote letters to Martin Luther King?" Louis nodded, his gaze softening like a lake after rain. "I still have the originals, right here in this bag." Malik turned back to the crowd, then spoke quietly, but with a resonance that rang like a church bell. "If someone like him gets treated like a bad guy, then one day people like me will be treated that way too." A gentle rose from someone in the crowd, then another. Then the whole park erupted in applause, not in rage, but for a truth finally spoken. Right at that moment, the press arrived. A reporter from Savannah Daily News pushed forward. "I just verified. Mr. Barrett is the lead author of the 1973 State Education Reform Bill. He's been honored by the Smithsonian. This isn't just an administrative incident anymore. This is a civil rights scandal." now removed from the scene. Jensen stood beneath a tree, pale as chalk. He heard every word, each one like a nail, sealing his career's coffin. Julian turned to Louis. "Would you like to leave now, sir?" Louis smiled, then shook his head. "I once sat on a bus next to Rosa Parks. If she didn't stand, then I won't either." And so the wooden bench beneath that old tree wasn't just where an older man had stopped to rest. It became the place where justice stirred from slumber, the first tremor of a coming societal earthquake. Less than an hour from the Savannah Police Department headquarters, internal phone lines were ringing off the hook. Back at the park, the circle of onlookers had now spread to the edge of the reflecting pond, encircling a center point. The entire city was about to learn by name. A cameraman from the local TV station had arrived. LED lights flicked on. The camera panned toward Louis Barrett, who had calmly returned to his wooden bench beside Julian Carter. He took a deep breath, then looked straight into the lens. "I'm not a media personality," Louis said, his voice deep and clear. "I'm not doing this for recognition, but I will not sit quietly while someone uses my existence as an excuse to silence their wounded pride." A female reporter asked Mr. Barrett, "Do you have any words for young people watching this unfold?" Louis nodded gently. "Yes, don't let my age fool you into thinking I'm tired. I may not have the strength to march anymore, but I am still clear-eyed enough to stand between justice and forgetfulness." In the park, Officer Jensen, now isolated from the scene, was asked by two senior officers to surrender his weapon temporarily, an unofficial sign of suspension. One of them asked, "You got anything to say about what happened this morning?" Jensen bit his lip and looked down at the grass. He said nothing. Meanwhile, Julian was on the phone. He called the Southeast Regional Office of the Department of Justice. "I need formal authorization for state-level oversight. We have footage, witnesses, violations of Amendments 4V and War 14. Send the review team immediately." He paused briefly, then added, "And while you're at it, patch me through to comms. I want a formal press statement drafted within the next 3 hours." Right after the call, Julian returned to Louis. The elder statesman was standing now, gripping his cane, eyes fixed on the crowd in the square. "I was once beaten just for entering a library," Louis murmured. "Now I walk into history just by sitting still." Julian was silent, then asked, "Would you be willing to speak publicly this afternoon?" Louis tilted his head. "I've written far too many speeches for other people. It may be time I wrote one for myself." Meanwhile, from multiple angles, short clips of the incident were rapidly spreading across TikTok, Twitter, and Facebook. One particular clip surpassed 1 million views in just 45 minutes. Capturing the moment, Louis said, "You are touching history, not a suspect." The hashtag #justice on the bench began trending, spreading nationwide from civil rights groups to university campuses. In the hallway outside the Savannah mayor's office, an aide whispered, "If we don't respond by this evening, we're letting the media write the whole narrative." The city leader looked up at the TV screen, where Louis Barrett spoke to a young boy while cameras rolled. "Then we need to respond, not with words, but with action." The section closes with a status update from student Raina Carrington, lighting up a phone screen. "Today, I saw an old man do what an entire system wouldn't dare. Stand tall by sitting down." 3:00 p.m. Forsyth Park. The plaza in front of the central statue was no longer open. People from all over Savannah, students, veterans, teachers, and parents, gathered without any formal call. They came because Louis Barrett was still there, a pillar in the eye of the storm, on a makeshift stage built at the steps of the park building. A modest banner hung behind the speakers. This is where history was challenged and stood up. Nora Delgado, the first journalist to live stream the incident, stepped up to the microphone. "I'm not standing here today as a reporter. I'm standing here as a citizen who witnessed this. That when justice falls asleep, the people can wake it with a video, a stare, an old man who refused to move. She turned to Louis, locking eyes with him, like a daughter would with her father. We owe you more than an apology. We owe you action. Julian Carter stepped up next. He removed his DOJ badge in front of the waiting crowd and held it up. This badge gives me authority to intervene when the law is abused. But today, let me be clear. I didn't come here to rescue Mr. Louis Barrett. I came because he rescued us. Our dignity, our justice, our truth. Applause broke out first, scattered then swelling like waves. Louis Barrett stood up, cane in hand, spine straight, eyes lit. The entire square fell silent. I'm not speaking today to elicit sympathy. I've lived long enough to know that pity never brings change. Only truth does that. He pointed toward the wooden bench where it all began. I've sat on that bench for 20 years. I've watched trees grow tall and watched this city change. But one thing hasn't changed. The fear in the eyes of young officers when they see a black man who does not bow. His voice was low, but steady. If sitting still causes fear, then the problem isn't me. It's a system broken at its roots. A little girl around 10 years old suddenly stepped onto the stage, clutching a scribbled drawing. In her picture, Mr. Louis sat on a bench surrounded by bright colors and letters that read, Grandfather of Hope. Louis bent down to receive the drawing, his lips trembling. This is why I didn't get up. Not because I'm weak, but I needed to hold the seat for those coming after me. In the crowd, a young pastor called out from below the platform, Mr. Barrett, you've done what scripture and politics could not reminded us, that kindness doesn't have to shout, it just has to stand firm, like stone. At the end of the ceremony, the mayor of Savannah made a formal declaration. From this day forward, October 12th, shall be known as Barrett Civic Day, honoring the resilience, dignity, and right to exist of every human being, regardless of skin color, age, or title. National media erupted. CNN, NPR, and the BBC all ran features. Twitter exploded with clips from the speech, especially this quote, I didn't move because I was holding the line for all of us. Barrett Bench Day became a global trending hashtag in under 4 hours. At the end of her live stream, Nora Delgado concluded, Today Savannah didn't just witness a protest, it witnessed the turning of a moral tide. The next morning, Savannah Police Department headquarters. The air was thick as a lead. An emergency report from the Department of Justice had arrived. Its title, The Barrett Incident, Urgent Request for Federal Civil Rights Investigation. Inside the conference room, Police Chief Mendez read each line aloud in a gravelly voice. The conduct of Officer Tyler Griggs has been classified as a severe violation of Title 42, Section 1983, concerning the deprivation of civil rights under color of law. The room fell silent. Eyes glanced around. No one denied it. The truth was undeniable. Meanwhile, social media erupted. Major news outlets updated the story by the hour. International media dubbed Louis Barrett the man who sat down and awakened a city. The video from yesterday's ceremony surpassed 20 million views on TikTok. A group of law students at Emory University launched the hashtag campaign #HerSitWithBarrett, calling for restoring civilian oversight of law enforcement in communities of color. A New York Times editorial stated, Mr. Barrett's silence was not helplessness. It was a whip against America's conscience. And his rise from that bench was a warning to every officer who has forgotten why they wear the badge. Pressure mounted on the police department. Hundreds of calls, emails, and letters from civil rights organizations poured in. A petition demanding the immediate termination of Officer Griggs, gained over 200,000 signatures in less than 48 hours. From within the department, an unexpected moment emerged. Lieutenant Raymond Ellis, a 28-year black veteran officer, held a surprise press conference. "I've stayed silent for too long. I was reassigned for calling out a colleague's racism. The Barrett case is the final straw. I will fully cooperate with the Department of Justice." The DOJ's Atlanta office dispatched Special Envoy Eleanor Price to Savannah, accompanied by 7 federal civil rights investigators. All complaints from the past 10 years were ordered for review. At the park, Louis Barrett's bench was surrounded by flowers, thank you letters, and tribute signs. A group of elementary students came to draw Grandpa Louis and the Staff of Light. A retired Vietnam veteran handed Louis a medal from his old unit. "You're a commander without a uniform, but you've made the entire platoon listen." Louis Barrett still came every morning. It's still black coffee. It's still a folded newspaper. But now he was no longer alone. An older woman sat beside him, her hand trembling as she placed it gently over his. "This is the first time I've felt that sitting here is a political act, and I'm proud of that." In a leaked internal email, Police Chief Mendez wrote, "The system can no longer shield itself. If we don't clean from within, we will be cleansed from the outside." Julian Carter submitted an official memorandum to the DOJ. "We are initiating procedures to activate Regulation 14441, temporary federal oversight of the Savannah Police Department. There is ample reason to believe this is not an isolated incident, but the visible peak of a deeply corroded structure." Office of the Mayor of Savannah. Late afternoon. An emergency meeting was convened between city leaders, Department of Justice representatives, and the Special Investigation Team. No more evasion. Julian Carter. Now, the central figure laid out a report over 100 pages, thick before them. The first page read, "Targeted Patrol Allocation System, Codename, Blue Watch." What lay inside was something no one was ready to face. A covert program that had operated for nearly a decade, directing disproportionate patrol increases in black neighborhoods, racially biased heat maps used to schedule patrols, traffic stops, and performance reviews, even a processing efficiency ranking based on how many people were detained, regardless of cause. Within the police department, the silence broke. Officers who had long kept quiet began speaking up. A retired sergeant revealed he had been threatened for refusing to patrol based on quotas. A young female officer broke down in tears, admitting she had falsified citations to meet targets. An internal purge began. 13 officers were placed on 48-hour suspension. 3 submitted resignations overnight. 1 was arrested for falsifying internal records. On the media front, the pressure was relentless. CNN called it the Watergate of the precinct. The Washington Post published a column titled, "If not for Louis Barrett and the touch of his cane, would Savannah have ever looked at itself?" The public reacted in powerful ways. A group of local youth painted a massive mural on a park wall. The old man, the wall, and the light. In schools, teachers launched new sessions called Building Justice from a Park Bench, where students shared emotions and asked questions about civil rights. On TikTok, the clip of Mr. Barrett standing and saying, "You don't know who I am," was reimagined in hundreds of versions. Funny, heartfelt, and deeply respectful. A new perspective emerged. Elijah Ross, a former officer who had once worked alongside Tyler Griggs, wrote a lengthy Facebook post. "I saw him ignore protocol with people of color. I saw him mock an elderly woman, wrongly detained because she looked like someone on a wanted poster. But I stayed silent, because I was afraid I can't be silent anymore." The post was shared over 2 million times. At the park, Louis received a surprising invitation from the mayor's office. "We'd like you to join the Community Law Enforcement Reform Council, not as a symbol, Mr. Barrett, but as someone still living, someone still watching." Louis responded calmly. I won't change an entire system, but I'll keep a chair empty at the table for those who've never been heard. That evening, during a live interview, Julian Carter delivered a line that would be quoted across the country. It's not Mr. Louis Barrett who needed protection. It's the good part of ourselves, the part that's forgotten. How to recognize a human being just reading a newspaper. And in the park beneath the familiar oak, Louis Barrett still sat. Not much had changed since that first day. Black coffee, a folded newspaper, and the cane, now a symbol, but still what he leaned on, just like always. Savannah High School, Monday morning. During the first period of civics class, Ms. Amira Jacobs, a black woman in her early 30s, walked into the classroom holding a tablet, already in the queue with the video from the park incident. Her voice echoed across the room full of high schoolers. Today, we're not talking about tests. Today, we're talking about the courage to stay seated. The class went silent. A few students raised their hands, and then, like a dam, breaking voices burst forth. Why was he suspected? Just because he was old and black. I saw my dad get pulled over just for driving through a white neighborhood. If nobody filmed, this would anyone even believe it happened? Across coffee shops, churches, and community centers, the entire city began talking about Louis Barrett. It was no longer just the story of one man being wronged. It had become the spark for hundreds of long-buried questions. How many people have been wrongly stopped but never spoke up? How many officials got away with wrongdoing because they were protected? How many years can we walk into a public park and not scan for suspicious eyes? At the federal attorney's office, Marcus Langston held dozens of letters. One was from a 13-year-old boy named Jaden Hill, written in messy handwriting. Mr. Marcus, I want to be like you. I want to sit next to someone being bullied and stand up like you did. Marcus smiled, not because the letter was cute, but because it revealed something deeper. People weren't just reacting. They were learning. They were changing. At the city council, a public hearing was held. An older man stepped up to the podium, voice trembling. His name was Harold Mills, a retired bus driver. I was pushed off a bus when I was a teenager because they said I didn't look like I belonged. I've lived my whole life keeping that story quiet. But today, because of Mr. Barrett, I'm saying it out loud. The whole chamber rose in applause. At Georgia Southern University, students launched a new initiative, the Bench Project. Its goals: create dialogue spaces between police and community members, host bias awareness training for new officers, document stories like Mr. Barrett's in a public digital archive. Their website crashed within 3 hours due to overwhelming traffic. Media began to shift focus. At first, the headlines were sensational. 81-year-old man humiliated in park. Now the editorials were more thoughtful. We once believed major movements needed the young, the strong, the loud. But perhaps what we needed was an older man, a walking cane, and one good reason not to move. At Mount Zion Church, Pastor John Whitaker, a white minister, stood before his congregation with an unexpected confession. Today, I apologize. For years, I chose silence, fearing lost members more than a lost conscience. And I won't be silent anymore. And in his small room, Louis Barrett received a call from a place he never expected. The president invited him to Washington to serve on the Civil Rights Advisory Council. Louis replied simply over the phone, I don't need a title, but if someone needs to hear, I will tell the story. Someone pinned a handwritten note to the bulletin board outside the Savannah Central Library. A grade school student wrote it. I don't remember his name, but I know he's the man who sat down so everyone else could stand up. A church bell rang. Not for a funeral, not for a wedding, but because Savannah had awakened some of its truth, had long left asleep. Savannah. A late autumn Sunday morning. Soft sunlight filtered through the old trees at Forsyth Park. A crowd gathered around the familiar wooden bench, the very place where it all began. But today, the bench was not alone. Beside it stood a newly unveiled bronze statue, an older man sitting holding a folded newspaper, his cane resting by his feet, his expression calm. Not the face of one man, but of all. The small plaque below read, "Dedicated to those who sat for what was right, so we could stand for one another." Louis Barrett sat in the front row, his cane resting across his knees, his felt hat on his lap. Around him were Marcus Langston, students, children, and citizens from every corner of the community. Behind him were dozens of camera lenses, but his eyes focused only on the statue and the weathered bench beside it. There were no long speeches, no pomp, only the words of the man himself, just as he once looked directly at the officer who held his wrist. "I don't sit here to be remembered. I sit because I once wasn't allowed to. This bench used to be someone else's privilege. Now it's everyone's symbol. We don't build statues to feel pride. We build them to remind each other. Silence is no longer an option." Applause broke out. Not the stadium roar, but the steady heartbeat of a city healing together. A white child ran forward and placed a white daisy at the statue's base. Her mother, a former police officer, stood quietly behind her, eyes glistening. Marcus Langston stepped forward and handed Mr. Barrett an envelope sealed with the U.S. Department of Justice insignia. "We hereby establish the local Civil Rights Investigative Unit, named in your honor. But more importantly, we carry your legacy across the United States." Mr. Barrett smiled gently. "Don't carry my name, carry the responsibility." That evening, footage of the ceremony spread across social media, from California to New York, from schools to police, precincts. People didn't just share a story, they shared a promise. Every park still has a bench no one has dared to sit on. A few days later, in a small town in Alabama, an 87-year-old black woman sat outside the town hall holding a sign, "Louis Barrett's grandchild here." No one asked her to leave. People gathered around her, and the cameras began to roll. Savannah is no longer the same. But more importantly, people have begun to believe that change can arrive through calm, not because they are no longer angry, but because they now understand the power of presence. The final words from Mr. Barrett himself, captured during a televised interview. "I'm not a leader. I'm not a symbol. I'm just an old man who lived a lifetime of being dismissed. But if my sitting down that day helped someone else stand up today, then maybe I was sitting in the right place after all."